reflect about a little bit more about the material and the kinds of questions I've raised here, and there's still time to do that. And I might as well inform you that we will be sticking to the original schedule. So there will be two sessions on Thursday. That's when it'll conclude, and I'll be there until the very end. The only difference now is that today we were supposed to only have the morning session. But since we're having an afternoon session as well, so tomorrow we'll have only one session. Tomorrow we'll have only one session in the morning, which Abhishek will be leading, and then you're off for the rest of the day, and then we'll have the last two sessions as originally scheduled on Thursday, right? That's Thursday, yeah. And there is some kind of formal valedictory session or something?
Yeah,
where
we will announce that tomorrow, like the distribution of participation certificates and all that will follow on Thursday, like the very last.
Yeah. So I think we conclude at about 3:30 or 4 or something like that on Thursday, maybe something like that. Yeah. All right. Yeah. All right. So this is the last of the sessions that I'm going to be formally leading. Abhishek will be taking over tomorrow and day after. And this particular session is devoted to colonial anthropology. Although that is not exclusively the focus of this session, because we're speaking about the census as well. And in fact, Herbert Risley, whose book you're reading, The People of India, for those of you who are not familiar, by the way, many of these colonial documents, many of these books from that of this sort have been reprinted by what is called low-price publications based in Delhi. This is 300 rupees. Of course, for 300 rupees, you get a certain quality only, so the quality of the print is extremely poor. But nonetheless, you can pick up these kinds of volumes, including Hunter, James Mill, and many, many others in this particular series. So Risley was, in fact, the Census Commissioner of India as well. I mean, he was in charge of the anthropological department or the ethnological department, but he was also the Census Commissioner of India. And so in this particular session, we're actually concerned with a number of things, all of which we're going to be only able to skim in some ways. But once again, my endeavor here will be to sort of give you the larger canvas to help you think through some of the issues raised by these kinds of records. Here we are talking about, what are the records that we're talking about? We're talking about three different kinds of records. One is the census itself. What is the history of the census? What do we mean by census? The second would be what you might call anthropological studies, caste manuals. There's a large number of these. There's a man called Thurston who produces a 4-volume work on the castes of South India. And thirdly, what we're really talking about here is what you might call specialized monographs, such as this very peculiarly titled book, which I happened to chance upon about 25 years ago, called The History of Railway Thieves in India. And I persuaded a publisher to bring out a new edition with an edition with the introduction by myself. So we're looking at these kinds of works, and I'm going to talk about each of them briefly. But there is a larger theoretical canvas, which is furnished by Brani Cohn's essay to this particular session. And the essay I'm speaking about here is called Census, Social Structure, and Objectification in South Asia. So that particular canvas that I'm speaking about is furnished by the word objectification. Right? What do we mean by objectification? What salience does it have in this colonial context in particular? That's the question, for us. So let's begin with the census for a moment. What is a census, would you say? If you had to define a census, What is it? Hey, and you just take a chance. I mean, there are no exams here going on here. I mean, I'm sure you all know what a census is, but take a chance. Now you're thinking to yourself, this is some kind of trick question as usual. Whatever definition I gave will not suffice because there'll be something else in mind. Well, that may be the case, but just tell me what you think a census is. That's all.
Demographic enumeration.
Demographic enumeration. Fine.
Survey.
Huh?
Survey.
Survey.
People are demographic.
Demographic enumeration, survey,
So statistical tool.
statistical tool. But what is specific to it? There are many kinds of statistical tools, correct? So you see, think of it this way, that when you give a definition, but then you're not really telling me what a census is, because a statistical tool, if I counted all the chairs in this room, you could say it's a census, but it would be an odd usage of that word, right? Usually a census would be of people or homes or households, but it may even be, you may even say that there's a census of dogs and cats. It's possible. It's possible to argue that, but again, that would not be the commonly understood meaning. So if we counted all the dogs in Silchars, would that be a census? It may be, but that would be less critical than but you can see that statistical tool would be insufficient. So so let's go with somebody said survey, right? You said Sagarika, right? Survey. So survey, yeah, but survey is too general because there are such things as a botanical survey. There is a botanical survey. There's a geological survey. A geological survey would be really a stretch to call it a census. Yes, you could count the different kinds of rocks and minerals found in an area, but to call it a census would again be a bit of a stretch. But perhaps if one spoke poetically, that might work. But so the closest we have is a demographic enumeration. Now the question is, let's try to elaborate upon that. What do we mean when we say demographic enumeration? So if I count all of you here, that's a census. We could conduct a census at NID Silchar and determine how many heads there are, right? Although that would be so rudimentary. It's not clear that we would need a fully operative state mechanism to do that. Why would it be so rudimentary? Because if all we were doing was counting heads, the census doesn't just count heads. It creates classifications. What does the Census of India do? There was a census conducted 5 years ago because it's conducted every 10 years. The first census was conducted in 1871, and it's a 10-year exercise. And what does the census do? It actually, I happened to be in India when the census was taking place because I had relocated. So the census enumerator came to the door, and with this big broadsheet, and they ask, what is the level of education of each adult in the household? How many males? How many females? How many adults? How many children? The ages? Okay, so forth and so on. Right. So it's clearly more than a demographic enumeration because it's more than a counting of heads. But we're not still getting to the political part of it. What is the politics? This is what you should know by now, that there has to be a politics to it. Somewhere there has to be a politics to it.
As you said, demographic enumeration based on certain social categories that the state comes up with.
Yes, but this definition is also apolitical in some ways. A demographic enumeration of certain groups, all right, according to certain norms of classification. We can elaborate a bit more. According to certain norms of classification. I say certain norms of classification because, for example, does the Indian census ask for caste or not? You all know? Does it ask for caste?
This time it asked, and earlier once it was asked.
So this time it
Asked.
It did.
Earlier, I think it is around 48 or 40. Like in between there were.
There was a gap of
Yeah.
in between of how many years? Over 50 years when caste was not asked.
And that was one of Nandan Nilekani's argument for the like Aadhaar card and all. Like I'm sure that you've gone through his Imagining India and all.
Yes.
So like one of the key arguments for like introducing the Aadhaar card was that
Yeah.
it won't go into caste and all of the underpinnings of caste.
Yes, but there is a real debate on. Let's not assume that there are only arguments to be made against the inclusion of caste. There are arguments to be made for the inclusion of caste. Very sound arguments on both sides, and I'm not adjudicating there. I'm not saying which side of the fence I would be on in this particular issue. But there are very sound arguments. For example, if you don't count, let's say you don't count caste, then how do you know how many people belonging to the OBC there are in a certain area? Now, if you thought that the OBC were a group of people that were worthy of being, entitled to some kind of state aid, some policy of be the beneficiaries of reservations. We know that reservations for SC, ST is not in question. The numbers may be fudged. The court may rule one thing or the other. That's a different matter, but that's not going to be disputed. But we do know that India presents a very strange anomalies which are almost unknown anywhere else in the world, where people, in fact, are trying to be recognized as being of a lower caste than they actually are. There are cases of that in India. And the reason for that is that if you get recognized as being of a lower caste than you actually are, then obviously you're the beneficiary of certain kinds of reservation policies. But leave aside those machinations by some groups of people. We can certainly say that if you don't include caste, then somebody could argue, well, how do you actually deliver social goods to groups of people? Social goods includes affirmative, what is called affirmative action in the US, or what is simply called quota policies here, reservation policies here. How do you deliver those social goods when you don't actually know how many people there are in that group? Right? So you can argue on both sides. That will take us, again, I think, far afield. And I can refer you to a number of pieces, including a lengthy piece I myself published on this question of, what are the arguments to be made against including caste and for including caste. But when we say norms of classification, that's what we mean, that these can shift. They don't have to be constant. Australia is one of the few countries in the world, at least in the developed world, all right, in the industrialized global north, that includes religion. In Australia, religion is a question that is always asked in the caste census, in the census. Okay, it's an item that's included. In some countries, they don't include it because that they believe that it actually helps to reify religion. It gives it an importance that perhaps it shouldn't have. And that's one of the arguments against including caste in the census here, is that by including it, you, far from helping to dissolve caste identities, you actually reify them. Now, this should help us understand what he means by objectification. See, thus far, I'm suggesting to you the definition that had been given was an apolitical definition. So, because in all of the answers that have been furnished, the assumption in a way is that there is a social reality out there which the census simply maps. The argument that has been given by people like Cohn and some others is following Foucault here in a way, or working in tandem with Foucault. This piece was first published in 1984 in a journal called Folk, actually, from Scandinavia, but it was in circulation in manuscript form for 20 years before it was published. Okay, so the essay actually goes back to the early 60s, even though the first publication was in 84. That objectification here, the argument is that the census, that we labor under a severe misapprehension when we think that the census only captures the social reality that is there. Whether it captures it in the simplest terms or the most complex terms, depending on the nature of the census, is another question. The argument here is that it doesn't simply capture that social reality, it actually creates it. It creates it. That, how does it create it? Because an individual may not actually be particularly sensitive to a particular identity he or she has. The census may in fact actually make that person sensitive to that identity, and that identity then becomes the basis for social mobilization when that individual sees that, there are 5,000 other people now who share that identity. I never thought of myself as being part of that identity, and those 5,000 people then in fact actually create a collective identity, which becomes the grounds for a certain kind of social mobilization. If you look at this, if you got to this end of this piece, there's a very interesting here ending here. Let me just read the ending here. In 1931, this is the last page of the article. In 1931, the consciousness, that is before the footnotes, before the bibliography. In 1931, the consciousness of the significance of the census operation had reached a point where Indians were not merely content to petition and to write books, but some groups set out to influence the answers which people would give in the census. In Lahore, just before the preliminary enumeration, a handbill was widely distributed by the Census Committee of the Arya Samaj in Lahore. This is what the handbill said. Remember, census operations have begun. Question: religion. You should answer Vedi Dharam. Question: sect. That is, the question in the census is, what sect are you? You say Arya Samajist. Caste. You should answer nil. So this is the Arya Samaj is saying, well, caste is actually an accretion. This is something that was not part of the Vedic sensibility, right? Race, Aryan, right? What does that mean, actually, right? Question: language, Arya Bhasha. Arya Bhasha, right? You should say that. Now, you see, so let's supposing 100,000 people answered that. 100,000 people. Now, it's not as though there is a language we call Arya Bhasha. This is what it means. The census is not simply mapping the reality there. It is actually creating a new reality in many ways, and it's helping objectify certain identities, which may never, in fact, actually have been part of the social fabric of that community. So this is what it means, and this word objectification, in fact, is a word that can be used apropos of virtually all the bodies of knowledge that we have thus far encountered. Right? It's very much in keeping with that argument. I read out a sentence to you yesterday from Cohn's article, The Command of Language and the Language of Command, where he said that actually it was the Indians who were the creators of this knowledge, but the Europeans were the ones who codified and transmitted it. And I am aware of the fact that there are all kinds of arguments that can be given to suggest that, well, maybe this argument is a bit of a stretch, There's also arguments which might say that, well, what is particularly colonial about it? Was there not something such as a pre-colonial census? And there are a number of historians who worked on this question of Norbert Peabody would be one. Were there pre-colonial censuses that took place in India? We know that in certain Rajput kingdoms, a few of them, something like a pre-colonial census, if you want to call it that way. Cohn's piece talks about a census that took place in Banaras long before 1871. In fact, somewhere around 1801, 1805, I forget the exact date. And how was that census conducted then? You didn't actually go and count every head. But what you did do was you determined the number of households in the city of Banaras. When we say city of Banaras, there also, as in the case of Delhi, any city of that kind, there's a technicality. The actual city, as opposed to the greater metropolitan area, we won't get into that. I think the general idea is, however the city was then defined, which might be the households contained between one end of the Ghats to the other end of the Ghats. Okay, right? So, because Varanasi, by the way, is a word comprised of Varuna and Asi, right? The Ghats at either end, all right? So now the question here is that how did they do that census? What they did was they counted the number of households. They counted the number of households and then basically figured out that each household has roughly 5, 6, 7, 8 inhabitants. Whatever the number of inhabitants, you take an average number, you multiply that by the number of households, you get an approximate head count. How many people there are in Nasi. But that's all they were doing, fundamentally. And some of those rudimentary censuses would include distinctions between males and females. Because once you're beyond the whole number, then the first thing you do is male, female, all right? And we can get into complications. What if you are a hijra? How do you classify yourself? You classify yourself as male, female, right? So this is obviously one of the problems, is that a census generally will not give you options beyond what are considered to be part of the commonplace wisdom. So for gender, it will only give you male or female, right? For religion, it will give you state whether you're a Hindu, state whether you're a Muslim, Sikh, Parsi, Jew, as the case may be. Now, let's take the case just momentarily, just to introduce the complications. What the implications are of objectification. In Japan, one census after another has shown that up to 90% of the people declare themselves as followers of Shintoism. Another 60% declare themselves to be followers of Buddhism. Now, I hope you see the problem. If you add 90 and 60, that's 150%. That's not possible, right? If you said 30 and 40, and then you added up all the others, and that was remaining 30, it rounds out to 100. What's the problem here? The problem here is that a person could have multiple identities. So when the census enumerators went around, that is that these are not exclusive categories. And even Hindu and Muslim are not exclusive categories necessarily. So in Gujarat, in the Bombay presidency, because Gujarat was part of the Bombay presidency, except for some of the native states, the census enumerators, you can find this in the Bombay, in the Imperial Gazetteer series, if you want to check it out. In the Imperial Gazetteer series, and then go to the volumes for Bombay presidency, and then go to Gujarat, and see, and then go to the index and look up a group called Hussaini Brahmins. Okay, think about that phrase, Hussaini Brahmins. So when the census enumerators are going around, they run into people who call themselves Hussaini Brahmins. So these colonial officials say, I don't understand what that means. That's a strange beast. If you're a Brahmin, how can you be a Hussaini Brahmin? Hussain is a Muslim name. So either a Muslim or a Brahmin. And say, no, we're Hussaini Brahmins. In other words, these are people who claim at least two identities, if not more. that we're Brahmins, but we consider ourselves followers of Hussein. Okay, it's the same thing, you would get into the same set of questions when you look at the Mayos, on which Shail Mayaram has done quite a lot of work. That these are people who call themselves Muslims, but they take all their names from Mahabharat's clan names. Okay? And there's a medley of religious practices that you find among them. However, what the census will do is it will attempt to push you into one category or the other. The census generally will not reflect that kind of complexity. It will try to aim for an objectification. That you're either this or you're that. You cannot be both. So this word that is emerging in the second half of the 19th century is not only an enumerative word, which is the category we have used thus far. It is not only a bounded word, but it is a word in which objectification is increasingly assuming explanatory value and social value. Right? That is, I think, the main thrust of the argument that Cohen is giving in this essay on the census. And the census, as I said, first commences in 1871. It was intended to be first commenced in 1861, but that was too close to the years of the rebellion, the suppression of the rebellion. So it was too chaotic. Administration was too chaotic at that time, and of course the company had also been abolished now, and the rule of India went into the hands of the crown. So there was a change in some of the administrative structures. And to make a long story short, they were not able to carry out the census of 1861. So they actually commenced it in 1871. But the 1871 census is not the best census to really look at, simply because it was the first full-scale operation that the British had launched. And they were not fully aware of all the implications of what they were doing, nor was it a census which was really comprehensive, certainly not to the extent to which the following census would be 1881, 1891, and so on. All right. So those are some of the general considerations to be kept in mind when you're looking at something like the census, a body of knowledge that creates a certain kind of objectification. Yes, belongs to the enumerative world, but this is a specific form now of enumeration. It doesn't simply map the social reality there, right? It in fact actually helps to shape that social reality. It creates it, it modifies it, right? And it is part of an instrumentality of governance. The instrumentalities of governance are increasing in numbers. They're becoming more complex. For example, the kind of work that Risley does, which we'll be turning to shortly, is not really possible in the late 18th century, right? There you get those general kinds of histories. Now you're going to get a lot more detail, because of course, one of the things that's happened also in the interim period is that over the course of the last 100 years, the British have been accumulating a substantial amount of data. I think that you've seen by now, right? Various kinds of various forms of statistical data, ethnographic data, demographic data, and of course data about the natural world. Now, having talked about the census, let me turn to the history of railway thieves, and then finally we'll turn to Risley. The history of railway thieves is a book that was published under a series called the Criminal Tribes and Caste series. Okay, so this is number 1, Criminal Tribes of India series, the history of railway thieves with illustration and hints on detection. And the particular edition that you're looking at is the 4th edition in 1915, which when I first encountered this edition, I found it rather odd that a seemingly esoteric work such as this had gone into a fourth edition. I don't know scholarly works today that go into four editions. It's hard enough to sell one edition, forget about four. So, there must have been some kind of market for history of railway thieves. People must have been intrigued by what do we mean exactly by railway thieves. And what is meant here by the author is thieves who specialize in working the railways. That rather, people who specialize in stealing on railway platforms, in trains, and so forth and so on. Now, let me give you a little window into a number of issues. Once again, because some of that literature that we've been looking at doesn't address it. All right? Let me begin with fingerprinting. It's an issue that comes up in the book. That's why I bring it up as well. Fingerprinting. Does anybody know the history of fingerprinting? Yes?
It was first introduced in colonial India, right? Even before it was introduced in Britain, as far as I know.
Yeah. And anything else you know about it? No. Okay, that's fine. No problem. Fingerprinting. So, yeah, fingerprinting was invented in India during the colonial period. There is a little town known for all its little size, it's actually known for three remarkable things, as it were. I was there a few years ago in Bihar, called Motihari. So Motihari is where Mohandas Gandhi had launched a campaign against the indigo planters. This is discussed at considerable length in his autobiography. Secondly, it's the birthplace of George Orwell, known as Eric Blair. That was his birth name, and he was born in Motihari. Okay. And thirdly, this is where fingerprinting was actually invented. Nobody knows that really. The credit all goes to an Englishman. This is partly what Cohn and many others had argued, that there are all these intermediaries and mediators and middlemen, and they're never recognized any of these. A man called Henry. Henry is usually edited along with Francis Galton. But Galton sort of did the more theoretical work in Europe, and Henry was a police officer in India, and he is usually credited with the invention of fingerprinting. But in fact, and he then went on to become Commissioner of Police of London. Right? So this is also another interesting thing which we unfortunately cannot talk about. If we had a much larger class on colonialism, then we would look at how, in fact, certain practices started under the colonial dispensation here and then were sent off back to England, as it were. Okay, that it works in that direction as well. It's not simply colonial officials coming from there working in India, but it's what happens when these officials go back very often to Britain, all right, and in some ways might fundamentally alter practices, in this case, of policing, for example. The experience that was used in India became quite important to try to manage crowds in Britain. Because if you could manage crowds here, you could certainly manage them in Britain. The experience that you gained here would certainly help you to manage crowds in Britain. But that's an aside. I just mentioned it so that you think about it. What is the nature of transmission, all right, and exchange here. So anyhow, this credit is given to Henry, but it's very clear that in fact it was actually one Hindu inspector and one Muslim inspector. This is how it's described in the archive, who were actually decisive. And this Muslim inspector comes from Motihari. So that's the third thing about Motihari. Were actually decisive in the invention of fingerprinting. And you will be staggered to know how this idea came about and why fingerprinting was at all important. It was important because if you read the history of railway thieves, you find out that there was a particular problem that the British encountered. So let's say at a railway platform, somewhere in Bihar, a boy called Papu is caught committing theft. So उसको एक दो थप्पड़ लगाए, दो Papu, make sure फिर से ना करना, make sure you don't do this again, Papu. Papu is given 2-3 slaps and kicked off. Then a month later, it turns out that a young boy called Mohan is caught stealing things from a railway platform. 25 miles down, 25 kilometers from where Papu had been caught. Mohan is the same person as Papu, but he's now going under the name of Mohan. He's not going under the name of Papu anymore. So Mohan is caught. It turns out to be the same policeman. A small stretch, because these guys operated during a relatively small stretch, both the railway thieves and the cops. It's relatively small stretch. So he said, yeah, this guy looks familiar, but he can't put his finger on it. So he gives him 2-3 slaps and lets him go. They keep it because he claims he's a first-time offender. साहब माफ कर दीजिए फिर से नहीं करूंगा, that kind of Hindi movie scene, right? You've seen it many times. Then a month later, Dev gets caught, but Dev is just yet the third name of Papu and Mohan, and this police officer is the same guy who catches him, and he says, yeah, this face is really beginning to look familiar, but how do you don't have a record? So the British are saying, we've got to find a way to pinpoint the identity. But they haven't found a way yet of being able to do it. Photography is in place. Photography has already come in. We could have a whole session on photography. And believe me, photography is very important, because if you look at this is a horrible reproduction. This is what you get when you buy low-price publications. But at the plates at the end of this book, right? All photographs. None of these individuals is named. They are all types. None of them is named. So you get male and female of the Bhenkar tribe. This is the male, this is the female of that tribe. But nobody bothers to give them a name. That's not necessary, right? This is how it works. So photography, just to reinforce the point I was talking about in the morning, right? Types. But photography, that's a whole other subject. What is the relationship between photography and the colonial enterprise? How is photography enlisted? I'm only giving you hints here. I've got multiple narratives going on here, right? One is objectification, one is now fingerprinting, now bringing in photography here. So they're thinking, how do we actually, but they're not using photography at this point. It's also an expensive procedure and very cumbersome. The cameras of those days, very, very cumbersome. So, photography was a very select thing at that point. So they're trying to find out how do you do it. Now, this is where it's an extraordinary story. It's never told in these terms, but there are small elements of the archives which help us suggest that. There was a Hindu police officer who was doing a round in Rajasthan. Now, if you've ever traveled in Rajasthan, if you've traveled to Chittor, for example, or Alwar, Ajmer, places like that, Bikaner, Rajasthan is full of forts, right? As you know. And in each of these forts, almost each of them, women committed johar, which is collective self-immolation. So when the Mughal armies had conquered the area, many of these Rajput women would jump down the well or commit collective suicide. Before they did so, before they went in to the last, this is the courtyard, and then the well is there, they would put their hand imprint. You can still see them, by the way, in some of these forts. If you look carefully and you know where to look, you'll see that they have put their hand imprints on this kind of caked cow dung. And when it solidifies, this guy thought to himself, yeah, he was looking, all of these prints look a little bit different. Because of course, the whole idea of fingerprinting is that everybody's fingerprints are different. Everybody's fingerprints are different. And then it occurred to him, so he goes back and he goes to his superiors. He knows that there's some discussion going on. How do we think about what method do we find to try to identify a person? How do we know that Mohan, Papu, and Dev are really the same guy? Well, one thing we can do is that we can take Dev's fingerprints, keep them on file, and then next time we catch this guy called Rakesh, or who is passing himself off as Rakesh, we take his fingerprints and then match them and see if we can find a match. And that's how fingerprinting came about. Right? That's how fingerprinting really came about. Of course, there were scientific refinements that came in, so forth and so on, and detailed studies of the rings, and a name is given to every single ring, every single kind of imprint, etc., all of that. So now all the history of railway thieves is not about the history of fingerprinting, of course. What it is about is this confusion that they had. The colonial officials, they're thinking, what do we do? Well, Papu looks like Rakesh, but this guy's going under a different name. Or he looks like Mohan, but he's going under a different name. And then, of course, it's a study essentially of the methods that they used. Did they operate singly? Did they operate in groups? Right? Then who are these railway types? And he divides them. The love of classification is to be found, of course, in there. The English had their match in Indians, probably, because the Indians are inordinately fond of classification. As I very often joke, I like the Kama Sutra, the number of positions it describes. Just be sure you have an orthopedic surgeon standing by, because if you try some of those positions, you might have to go to an orthopedic surgeon. You don't know what's going to happen, to be quite serious about it, right? But it's incredible, the classification that you find. Now, this is something that is, if you look at the Atharva Veda, the 84 ways in which you can, catch an adulterous husband. It'll give you a whole list, classification. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. There are 200 kinds of spells you can cast on so and so. It's full of that. So now I'm also pointing to something a little bit different. A point I have not made thus far. I want to just bring it to your consideration. And that is that, we always think of these worldviews as completely opposed. But there was a strand of a certain kind of empiricism in Indian thinking too. This love of classification. This is going to be a different form of classification, because classification need not always be rigid. It need not always become hardened. So we certainly had caste was based on classification. The question is whether these caste groups hardened in ancient times, or whether in fact that was a consequence of modern invention and modern intervention, right? But what he does in the history of railway thieves is that he then enumerates the types of railway thieves. What groups do they belong to? What is common is that all of them are part of criminal tribes or castes. Now, what is this thing called criminal tribes or castes? What it means very simply is that anyone born into that particular caste or tribe group is a criminal by birth. A criminal by birth. So if you're born into a group that is being notified meant that you were now listed in a government gazette. Okay? And so now, and the only way you can be removed from that is if you get denotified. A process that has not yet been completed in India at this point in time. There are still groups that have not been denotified. So there's a movement that's been led by Ganesh Devi and many others to try to help achieve that objective of denotifying criminal tribes and castes. All right. So if you were born into that particular group, if you are criminal by birth. And this in turn entails various kinds of consequences, because then a member of a criminal caste or tribe, obviously not infants, but I'm talking about young men in particular, as soon as you reached adolescence, okay, you had to go and report to a police station on a periodic basis. Right? There were restrictions on where you could operate, where you could work, where you could live. Those were some of the consequences of belonging to a criminal caste or tribe group. And once again, of course, here the idea is, of course, the idea that you are criminal by birth is an absurdity. But this was a different form of objectification that was taking place. And these books in this series were intended to provide a catalog of all of the groups. And then the notion was that each of these particular groups, that they engage in a particular profession. So it's circular, because of course if your life options are limited, right, you are restricted, if there was almost an expectation that you would actually do exactly the kind of activity that your group was reputed to do. So that if you were born into one of these groups which was engaged in theft on the railways, if you were born into that group, that indeed you would do that. Right? So so partly it becomes a promise, the problem of a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if I may use that language. That's the sort of thing that is really, going on over here. The work itself is not particularly complicated, but once again, what one needs is a certain kind of apparatus, a historiographical apparatus, a quasi-theoretical apparatus at least, to be able to understand exactly how the narrative is being shaped. Because what you really have is you have a kind of a narrative. If you read those 2 chapters, you know exactly what I mean, essentially describing who these people are, how they actually operate, how do they go from one station to another, how do they pass the jewels, let's supposing they've stolen jewels, how do they pass the jewels from one person to another, etc., etc. Right? I mean, the day-to-day operations of this particular group, and then a kind of an ethnographic report on who exactly they are, what are these groups, what do we know about their origins, so forth and so on. Right? And the colonial state was invested in furnishing a very elaborate account of this. So if you had to now just sit back for a moment and say, well, what are the kinds of intersections we're talking about over here, right? It's very clear that we're talking about a number of different things here. And we're talking about some process of what is called objectification. We're talking about a particular form of knowledge. In this case, it happens to be an ethnographic kind of monograph. There will be many such ethnic monographs, right? Ethnological monographs about whether it could be a criminal tribe, it could be a criminal caste, it could just be another caste group, not necessarily criminal caste or criminal tribe. There's going to be a large number of these kinds of, right? We're talking about here the deployment of photography, the history of railway thieves. I don't have the book here with me. I didn't carry the book with me, but the history of railway thieves has plates. It's got 7, 8 plates. So it gives you again a representation. Most of the plates are of a bunch of men put together. So that's a particular type of railway thief, because as I already pointed out to you, he actually classifies the railway thieves. We're talking about colonial systems of classification, the colonial machinery of law and order. The person who's writing this book is a member of the police service, a Rai Bahadur. That means he's been titled. Rai Bahadur meant an Indian who had been conferred a title. It was usually conferred upon those who were loyalists, by the way, those who were sympathetic to the colonial state, all right? Okay. And of course, we're talking here about such things as notions of criminality, and the one that's most obvious, but we don't think about it, with the development of the railways. I mean, if we're talking about railway thieves, so obviously you need a sufficiently developed railway network at this point for these people to operate. Because obviously, if you had only one train and one station, you're not going to get this kind of elaborate network that this person is really talking about. All right. So you can see there's close to 8-10 things that are implicated, that are at the intersection of the kind of discourse that is being created in history of railway thieves. And you might ask, actually, I mean, we'd have to really look at a large number of these, whether these works taken as a whole constitute a kind of discursive formation. Right? If it constitutes a discursive formation, then it means that all these works share certain features in common. There are certain kinds of continuities and certain kinds of discontinuities in this, right? And then there's a deployment of certain kinds of tropes. And those tropes might include some which we have talked about before, such as the idea of the cunning or wily Brahmin, the Muslim who is a fanatic, village community, the lazy native, right? Those are the tropes. But those would all be the elements of a certain kind of discursive formation. And if you take them as a whole, we could certainly ask whether these works reflect a certain kind of discursive formation. One last thing before I turn to Risley, and that is that if you wanted to complicate the narrative yet further, what you could do is you could take an earlier kind of discursive formation having to do with criminality. That would be the whole discourse on thuggee, okay, which was a matter of immense concern to the British throughout the 1830s, 1840s, and you get quite a lot of colonial literature on that. The whole suppression of thuggee, in fact, was very often celebrated as one of the greatest triumphs of colonial rule. That these bunch of people who operated on highways, I mentioned thuggee in particular because it's not just criminality and the notion of what you might call criminals by birth, which is what the thugs were supposed to be as well, and family networks, but also because the thugs, as you know, according to the colonial narrative, operated on highways. So there's yet again this question of mobility. Here we've got history of railway thieves, here we've got thuggee. This author of this book, Naidu, doesn't really invoke this kind of history, but we can when we're interpreting a work such as a history of railway thieves. Okay, so any thoughts that anybody has thus far on these texts? These two, the subject of census, or what Naidu has written in the history of railway thieves. Okay, so let me turn quickly now to the last of these. One of the major texts of colonial anthropology, Risley's People of India. Risley, by the way, is educated at Oxford. I'm sure you recall that I've mentioned this once or twice before, that certainly by the second half of the 19th century, the bulk, by far the greater bulk of the most well-known colonial officials are almost all graduates of either Oxford or Cambridge. And like most others of his kind, he is a member of the Indian Civil Service, of the ICS, selected for ICS in 1871. Okay, even before he had graduated from Oxford. He graduated from Oxford in 1872. right? So when he joins the Indian Civil Service in 1873, he's 22 years old. He's 22 years old. He works in Midnapur, joining the Chota Nagpur area, right? And he's going to really be a specialist on the Bengal presidency. He's going to spend the bulk of his years over there, a few years in India in between. And he's a key figure in the use of anthropometric statistics in anthropology. This book has, at the end of the book, there are these very technical appendices, seriations, okay? You can, tables and tables, or charts of that. These are all very technical tables. He also is an inventor of what is called the nasal index. So if I had to, some people say that this is a bit of a caricature. I don't call it a caricature. I think that that's more or less how you should understand it. That you could determine where you would place a person on an evaluative scale, depending on the distance between their nose and their belly button. Okay, you could do that. Of course, and you could look at also the shape of the nose, the distance between the nose and the middle of the eyebrows, the shape of the head. He has actually fairly detailed tables about that. This is all meant to be taken very seriously. That's what I'm saying to you. Okay, so if you look at this over here, for example, summary of measurement, these are all appendices. So the low price publication, one people faithfully reprinted all of that in the service of science. Mongolo-Dravidian type summary of measurements, dimensions of nose, proportions of head, and dimensions of nose includes height and breadth, the average, maximum, minimum, right, so forth and so on. So these are these anthropometric tables and statistics. In India, physical anthropology still reigns supreme. The vast bulk of people doing anthropology are still doing physical anthropology. There are, of course, people doing social and cultural and medical anthropology, among other fields, but physical anthropology still has a large number of adherents. And as I pointed out to you, this is all encompassing. The idea is you use all the tools. So use photography. Then you use statistical data, okay? And you make sure that you don't leave out cartography. So here's the map, which faithfully reproduces the map to be found in the original edition. India ethnology, that's what the map is called, India ethnology, and then he divides all the people of India into 7 racial groups: Mongoloid, Indo-Aryan, Dravidian, Mongolo-Dravidian, Aryo-Dravidian, Scytho-Dravidian, and Turco-Iranian, right? So Turco-Iranian would be people much further west, obviously, in what is present in Northwest Frontier Province, Baluchistan, and all of that, and it's color-coded. It's very interesting history, but this we don't have time to, how did maps become the way they are? How did they start to be used in this particular fashion? That's a subject, another kind of subject. But here, remember what I'm saying, right? That you've got a text, but then you've got a map, you've got plates, and you've got tables, and you've got charts. So the idea was you use all the tools available to you to give scientific credibility to the argument, to provide a scientific tenor to the argument. And in all of these cases, to reinforce what I have mentioned to you before now, what you really get is you get these types of people here. Okay? Sometimes you get an individual, sometimes you get a group of people. The only time when names are usually given is when either that person has been honored, felicitated by the British government, or is a member of an aristocracy. So in this case, you're actually given, for example, in this case, you have the picture of this individual, Subedar Major Sher Bahadur Khan. Turco-Iranian type. So you're told the type, he's a Turco-Iranian type, but he's given a name because he is a man of some distinction, all right? So those are the instances in which a person's name may be given, but typically what you get is, as I said, you'll get these photographs, and these simply describe the tribe or the type of person. Limbu. This person is called Limbu. That's a type, and that's the male specimen, and then that's the female specimen. All right. So this is typically how the material would have been arranged, because of course there is also the assumption, which is a naive positivist assumption, but it's very much the assumption with which people still work. That is, a photograph speaks 1,000 words. That it furnishes a kind of reality to your subject, which is ineradicable. Ineradicable. Some of those theories are being revised now with things like Snapchat, because you get an image and it vanishes in 10 seconds, right? Apparently. So, but here you have, the idea was that it's the imprint is there now. All right. Now, it's a massive work. So we obviously cannot really attempt to do justice to this, but I want to look at a number of considerations. And we begin with the table of contents. This is a second edition, edited by William Crook. You have to begin with little details, by the way. If for those of you who study colonial India, I don't know if you know, when you see the people of India by Sir Herbert Risley, KCIE, CSI. You know what that means, by the way? Does anybody? You know, Abhishek, by any chance? No. You find that, by the way, with every colonial name of a certain ranking. These are ranks. This is what Bernard Cole was talking about. How do you incorporate people into the body of the monarch? There is some notion at work here. KCIE. If it begins with a K, it's a higher order. KCI means Knight Commander of the Indian Empire. Okay? And you always put the highest rank, the highest order, the highest achievement at first, and it's in descending order of importance. I urge you, take up 2 minutes and go and look up Mountbatten's name. You all know who Mountbatten was. Earl Mountbatten of Burma, the last Viceroy General. There are 10 titles after his name. Okay, all in acronym form. I once happened to stay in London when I first went there due to archival work, and I rented a room for an English gentleman who had devoted his whole life to this stupid subject. He knew every rank and the whole history of that and when it had been created, and that's how I got to know about it. I would have known eventually anyhow, working with Barney Cohn, but that's what these are. CSI, Commander of the Star of India. This was a lower order. This was for Indians, basically. But then, when you gave the highest order to the British, then you give them the lower Indian order as well. So you'll see that in all of these books. And people took this seriously, because in those days, it was a way to distinguish Sir Herbert Risley, an Oxford graduate, from 5,000 other Oxford graduates. Because not all of them had a KCIE or KCGB, right? Or KCB, Knight Commander of the Order of Bath, for example. So it was a form of cultural capital. Just like if you have a degree from Harvard, a PhD from Harvard, you advertise it because it's a form of cultural capital. These are forms of cultural capital for those times. Right? So they're not incidental little details. It is exactly the sort of thing that the Mughal emperor was doing. When he appointed people to his court, and when he appointed people to his court, there was a system called Mansabdari system. Mansabdari system. So the British, you see, these are very interesting things because the British are also, I mean, of course, there was a system of granting honors in England itself, but they're also looking at what Mughal India is doing because, after all, they have taken over the role of the great Mughal. And in the Mughal period, this was taken very seriously. So when you were appointed a mansabdar to the court, it meant that you were allowed to be part of the court, part of the proceedings when the proceedings took place in the Diwan-e-Khas. Okay? And you then distinguish between a mansabdar of 500 from a mansabdar of 1,000 and a mansabdar of 2,000 and 3,000. What this meant was you were allowed to have cavalry of 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, as the case may be. So in the time of Aurangzeb, one of the things we find, although Aurangzeb is very often represented as a cruel, bigoted ruler who was anti-Hindu, we find that more Hindus were appointed mansabdars than Muslims. So there are all these interesting things that you can think about. But this is not trivia, that's what I'm saying to you. It's a form of cultural capital, number one. Right? Number two, it of course gives us some idea of the service that this person has performed to the empire, whatever one's own estimation of the value of that service. Right? Number two. Number three, we're saying that in fact this was a way for the empire, following a Mughal practice, to actually incorporate these people into the body of the monarch. Body of the monarch. England is a monarchy. And if you get a KCIE, Knight Commander of the Indian Empire, you are a Knight Commander of the Queen. Okay? Right? And number four, analytically discrete but related to third, is the fact that this was in fact a way of suggesting to the Indians that we are actually the legitimate inheritors of Mughal rule. We are not usurpers of the throne. Right? So begin, never gloss over. You see a title like this is like worth about 15 minutes. And several pages of commentary. If you think about it, how the whole thing is arranged. And in those days, of course, this is actually a very simple title. In those days, there's loved, particularly in the 18th century, very lengthy titles. The people of India, their sentiments and feelings, with a point of view of keep on going on, right? Okay, but it was common to give the little biographical affiliations of Herbert Risley, the most choice ones, corresponding member of the Anthropological Societies of Rome and Berlin, etc., etc. Second edition, edited by Crook. That's a very interesting long history, which unfortunately I can't get into because it's a little bit like, not quite like that, but Crook is going to add some notations. Nothing of the order of what was done by Wilson when he added the notations to James Mill's History of India, and fundamentally offered a very different text. Okay, and then he dedicates it to Sir William Turner, KCB. You see here again, you see that. That's the Knight Commander of the Order of Bath, which was one of the higher orders over there. So now, if you look at the table of contents, Chapter 1, physical types. Types. Very important. I think now I don't need to dwell on that. You understand exactly where I'm coming from over there. Okay, physical types, and then you get social types in Chapter 2. But this is where I think many of these British texts are also interesting, even though sometimes one reads them cynically and one reads them as I have, when I went through the famine report, for example. That is that There is sometimes, I'm not going to call it a playfulness, although we can read it as a kind of playfulness. There is an interest in things that seem incidental. So chapter 3 is in fact in many ways the most interesting chapter because it's called Caste in Proverbs and Popular Sayings. Now, how do we really make certain inferences about what the caste system is? What are the castes? Right? What do people think of caste? What are caste relations like? How can we make all of those kinds of inferences from Proverbs? Because of course what he's trying to suggest is that Proverbs will reflect the common wisdom, the folk wisdom. These are not necessarily people who are learned. And Proverbs usually do not have a provenance, if I may put it this way, right? Their origins are shrouded in mystery. They're timeless in a way. If you said, what is that proverb, a rolling stone acquires no moss? Well, if I ask somebody here, who is the author of that proverb? I don't know, certainly. I don't think anybody would know. Right? That's important because a proverb is associated with a kind of anonymity. And that anonymity is meant to suggest that this is part of the general wisdom of that people. Right? General wisdom of that people. Now this is important because Risley is granting that there is a scientific body of knowledge we can turn to, and he's going to take recourse to that. But he's also saying there is a body of opinion that we can take recourse to. Question is whether that body of opinion is going to confirm the scientific body of opinion or simply complement it or act contrapuntally and in fact offer a different perspective. That would be a very long task. You'd have to first read those first 2 chapters in great detail to see how he positions that material. How does he use the scientific material, and then how does he use this material? Or is he simply acting in the, and that's the simplest explanation, is he simply acting in the role of an ethnographer who's saying effectively that my job is to in fact actually furnish all the evidence, whether it's coming from scientific sources or whether it's coming from the common stock of wisdom. Right? Then I can give you an accumulative view of the subject of caste. Then chapter 4, caste and marriage. Now each of these chapters is of course crucial importance, caste and marriage. Right? Why is such a chapter very important? Because the whole study of caste, as this book shows you, was based on the supposition that in India, caste developed in a manner which was sui generis, completely distinct to India. The reason for that was that in India, there were very strict rules of marriage. Very strict rules of marriage. Such things as hypergamy were followed, right? So that would mean, for example, that a man of an upper caste may marry a woman of lower caste, but the reverse cannot happen. Why? Very simple.
That's a patriarchal and a patrilineal system. So if the woman of the higher caste marries somebody from lower caste, then their children would be lower caste children.
That's right. So, but there are a number of principles at work. Endogamy, hypergamy, so forth and so on. So what Risley is seeking to demonstrate is that there are very strict rules. And this helps us understand the universal history of mankind, not just the history of humankind in India. That's the important point. Why? Because in India you can observe in isolation these rules which in most other societies have not been followed. Right? In other words, we get a much better approximation of the different types of people that exist. In many other societies, you don't get that because there's been too much crossing. Too much crossing. I'm not saying I accept that. I'm just saying that this is how he projects it. And he also suggests that the physical landscape of India, right, had something to do with that. Let me just look at a couple of paragraphs here. As I said, it's absolutely impossible in a work of this scale to try to understand exactly what he's doing. But if you had to take an overall view, what is he saying? I didn't finish with the table of contents because then, of course, after caste and marriage, he has a chapter called caste and religion. All important, of course, the origin of caste, when did the institution of caste really originate? And in fact, actually, the last chapter, which is enormously interesting, called caste and nationality, where he gestures at the fact that there might actually be some form of nationalism based on caste mobilization. He actually gestures at that possibility, right? But let's look at a couple of pages in the beginning, and then one or two paragraphs in the middle to see how he begins to formulate some of his questions. So on page 2, he says, this country thus isolated by physical and historical causes comprises 3 main regions, and then he enumerates these 3 regions, the Himalayan region, the Madhya Desh, the middle India, Gangetic Plain, all of that, and the Deccan, right? All right, South India, the peninsula. The most recent of the 3 regions, the alluvial plains of the north, formed in prehistoric times the highway of the Aryan advance into India, and a large section of its inhabitants still cherish the tradition of remote Aryan descent. The influence of the Himalaya has been mainly negative. It has served as a barrier against incursions from the north, but all along the line of the hills, even among people whose speech is of Rajput origin, distinct traces may be observed of an intermixture of Mongolian blood. And then he talks about the inhospitable ways which separate India from Iran. So these are the external factors, right? And the unbroken chain of snowclad peaks, and passes only practicable at certain seasons opposes an effectual obstacle to the fusion of contrasting types. That the Himalayan mountain range, in fact, actually posed an obstacle to the fusion of contrasting types. So it was a physical landscape of India that made possible the isolation of India to begin with, and there was a commensurate social isolation, owing to practices of hypergamy, endogamy, and so on. And when I talk about tropes, look at this particular chapter, this particular paragraph, internal factors, which have influenced the development of caste in India. For the internal factors, we must depend to a great extent upon speculative data. Living organisms are more complex and less stable than their material surroundings. The hills may not be everlasting as poets had imagined, but they outlive countless generations of men. And the changes that time works in their structure do impress on them some record, however imperfect, of processes which have taken ages to complete. Man alone passes and leaves nothing behind. The archaeologists will have a severe problem with this kind of formulation. India, in particular, is conspicuous for the absence of the prehistoric evidence of which ethnologists in Europe have made such admirable use. There are no cave deposits, no sepulchral mounds or barrows, no kitchen middens, no lake dwellings, no ancient fortified towns. This, by the way, is all, of course, before the discovery of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. This is all before that. Indus Valley civilization was not known at this point in time. And no sculptured bones or weapons portraying the vicissitudes of the life of primitive man. What are the implications of this? The climate and the insects have obliterated all perishable vestiges of the past. So whatever ahistorical inclination Indians may have had, that was further amplified by the fact that in India the climates and the insects will allow no past to survive. Um, at the National Archive in Delhi, when I first went there, the most amazing thing that struck me was not their collections, but they had a poster of that size on the wall, framed, okay, a glass framed, and that poster was how to save a little manual on how to save archival material. So it gave you kind of a, and that poster itself was half chewed up by various insects. I mean, that's what he's talking about, basically. Okay, and that's the National Archive of India. You can imagine what the situation is in the Bihar archives, or one of these archives. The climate and the insects have obliterated all perishable vestiges of the past, and what nature may have spared a people devoid of the historic sense has made no effort to preserve. There are 1,000 quotations about Indians lacking a sense of history. Here is one, as explicit as you can find, right? What climate of insects have obliterated, right? The climate and the insects have obliterated all perishable vestiges of the past, and what nature may have spared, a people devoid of the historic sense has made no effort to preserve. To fill the blank, we have thrown back mainly on conjecture. Yet in India, conjecture starts from a more solid basis than in the progressive countries of the Western world. For here we have before our eyes a society in many respects still primitive, which preserves, like a palimpsest manuscript, survivals of immemorial antiquity. What is a trope here? We've gone over this trope. In a phrase, what is a trope? Indent, first couple of pages, unchanging India. Unchanging India. Nothing ever changes. There is no history. Here, there is no history is two things. Nothing ever happened, number one, and number two, there is no record. So the history in both senses, right? In a land where all things always are the same. I mean, you don't need very subtle skills here in this case of decipherment. In a land where all things always are the same, we are justified in concluding that what is happening now must have happened very much in the same way throughout the earlier stages of human society in India. And of course, he doesn't have to say it, but this is, let's say I said to you, let's say you were sitting for an exam and I said, translate this into a political theory. Political theory is that the only political system with which this is compatible is, which one? What's the political system that is compatible with this? Despotism. Despotism. All that happens is the head at the top gets chopped off, but the base remains the same. The peasant keeps on toiling away. What difference does it make to him whether the ruler is Muhammad of Ghazni, Babur, Elphinstone, or Narendra Modi? Doesn't make any difference. Right? That's the argument. It makes no difference at all because nothing ever really changes. So all the work of interpretation here will require you to do is to say, what is the political theory? Now, that is being tacitly invoked. This is not a work of politics, so he is not going to talk really about despotism for the most part, right? Except incidentally, there may be a paragraph here or two. I don't remember any such paragraph, but there may be, possibly. But there is a political theory, and this text is very political in that way. You see, that is what I'm trying to point your attention to. Okay? Observation of the present is our best guide to the reconstruction of the past. It ends with this attitude. God, what a boring statement. Observation of the present. Well, there is only observation of the present. frankly, is our best guide to the reconstruction of the past. Now, of course, in some generic sense, that's true, but it's not that generic sense that is being invoked. What's being invoked is the fact that, frankly, if you study what's happening now, you know what happened 1,000 years ago here. You see? You know what happened 1,000, 1,500 years ago. All right? So this is, again, a text that, despite its transparency, you'll then have to see what are the registers in which you might possibly read it. And one last set of comments, very briefly. I'm trying to find something, the notes that I made, which would be the most interesting. There are some hilarious, what I call hilarious passages about the nasal index, but you already know what I think about the nasal index. So we'll leave that aside. Let me look, let's, if you look at, just going to point your attention to a passage. Okay, so page 155. This is caste and marriage. All right. The particular passage I'm reading out, it's called, the way this text, sometimes some of the texts of that period have it. So you have the passage, and then in bold letters, you have kind of the subject heading. So you have an idea of what the subject matter of that paragraph is going to be. This is contrasts between India and Europe, right? Among the various causes which contribute to the growth of the race or the making of a nation, by far the most effective and persistent is the jus connubii, that is, the body of rules and conventions governing intermarriage. The influence of these rules penetrates every family. It abides from generation to generation and gathers force as time goes on. The more eccentric the system, the more marked are the consequences which it tends to produce. With men as with animals, artificial selection is more potent and works more rapidly than natural selection. In no department of life, that's why I'm reading this out. In no department of life is the contrast sharper between the East and the West. The stationary and the progressive societies. That's interesting. The East, stationary societies, the West, progressive societies, the races of India, and the nations of Europe. The first point which strikes an observer is the almost universal prevalence of the married state. Now here I'm tempted to somewhat agree with Risley. The question is whether we will want to draw out the political implications that he draws out. Right? By which I mean that when he says the first point which strikes an observer is the almost universal prevalence of the married state, what he's saying here is in India, it is almost inconceivable that a person will not marry or would not want to marry. And in the Hindi film, as you know, the solution to every young man's wayward ways is you find him a boy, a girl. As in middle class India, bete shaadi kar le sab theek ho jayega, right? This is what he's referring to. Okay. In Europe, sentiment and prudence hold divided sway. But this is the problem, that now you see he's obviously going to set up Europe as a kind of ideal on the other end. Sentiment and prudence hold divided sway, and the tendency on the whole is rather towards a decline in the number of marriages. It's very interesting he's writing this in 1900, because I still hear this, that this is what characterizes modern societies now. And the contrast is always made with what it was like 30 years ago, that now the kind of family that we knew, this argument I encounter constantly in Britain, the US, the kind of family that one knew is slowly shrinking, right? The nuclear family, husband, wife, one boy, one girl, cat, dog, right? 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 That's on the decline, you know. Right? But he's saying this over 100 years ago, you know. In India, neither of these motives comes prominently into play. Religion, on the other hand, which in the West makes in the main for celibacy, throws its weight in India almost wholly into the other scale. There, I think he's right, actually, in a way, but not entirely. Not entirely, because he's forgetting the whole tradition of the outsider, you know, the sadhu, right? Now, you could say that that's a very gendered tradition, though. That's a very gendered tradition, but that's also can be disputed. There was a provision for women to be renouncers too. All right. A Hindu man must marry and beget children to perform his funeral rites. See, but that's the reason why, according to him. Because if the Hindu man is not married and he doesn't have children to perform the rites, then, you know, his spirits, all of that, are going to haunt him, this and that, etc., etc. Lest his spirit wander uneasily in the waste places of the earth. If a high-class Hindu maiden is unmarried at puberty, her condition brings social obloquy on her family, and on a strict reading of certain texts entails retrospective damnation on 3 generations of ancestors. I don't know what his source is for that. 3 generations, you know, of ancestors. Which is he using some Hindu text? Is this common knowledge? You know, which part of India? Not clear. Despite all the pretensions to be scientific here, we don't know, actually. But the general obligation to marry is hampered by numerous conditions. In the West, the field from which a man can choose his wife is practically unlimited. You know. Now, of course, you had to read it in a critical way. You could say, yeah, well, that's because it's a free market economy. Everything's up for sale. You know, wide choice. You could read it cynically if you had to in that fashion. The restrictions based on consanguinity are few, and all but an insignificant number of marriages are determined by the free choice of persons who have attained physical maturity and believe that they know their own minds. I think this is, by the way, a bit of a stretch for the England that he's writing about. In India, throughout the ever-widening area dominated by Hindu tradition or influence, one set of rules contracts the circle within which a man must marry. Another set artificially expands the circle within which he may not marry. A third series of conventions imposes special disabilities on the marriage of women. A fourth injunction, not as yet universal but constantly gaining ground, forbids a widow to marry again, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now think about it. So what he's doing here is, let's summarize. What he's doing here is he's suggesting that, you see, even this here, in this long paragraph I've read thus far, there's been no mention of caste. If you think of it, right? Because what he's doing here is he's suggesting, and he will then proceed to do it in the following pages and the rest of this chapter. He's suggesting that you're really speaking about 2 entirely different social frameworks. One which you find in Britain and one which you find, or Europe more broadly, and one which you find in India. And one of the things he's going to go on to suggest, of course, is that what determines the social framework in India is the institution of caste. But let's say you have to put it in a different political language. Think back to what I was talking about just a little while ago in the morning. A woman and a man have practically unlimited choice in Britain who their partner is going to be. One individual chooses another individual. Right? It's not only a matter of choice, a choice can only be made by an individual. Here in India, there is no individual. The question of choice cannot arise. The woman and the man are members of collectivities. And the implications are that in the institution of marriage, the decision is also a collective decision. It is a decision which the decision is based on the consideration of whether this marriage will rebound to the benefit of the family as a whole or the community as a whole. You see, there are always missing terms of political sociology. Here again, it is a political argument because it's an argument about the nature of these societies, and then there are further implications to be drawn. That further implication in this case is going to the framework that was going to be shaped by Louis Dumont in a book called Homo Hierarchicus, probably the book that became the most influential book written, at least in the 20th century, on caste in India. What was the framework there? That the West is characterized by equality and India is characterized by hierarchy. Hierarchy. Right? That's the political sociology. That is, in fact, actually behind this particular framework. And the question that you will always have to ask yourself is that it's a question independent of these texts. It's a question more broadly when one does this kind of work is it the case that once you have that framework, and I believe that he has a framework which is tacitly given to him by this whole sociology of knowledge, of which he was aware and which he will contribute to himself, in this case Risley, that this framework, and what is that question? That this framework, if it's there in place, does he simply then in a way accommodate the data to this framework? Because of course the claim that he would make is that it's this data that he has collected which has actually helped him frame the questions in this particular way. That this framework was something that came to him because of the overwhelming nature of the data. But I don't think that that's even remotely possible, because there is a very dense colonial sociology of knowledge, which by this time is well in place, with all kinds of tacit assumptions about the nature of Indian society, various kinds of distinctions between the individual and the collectivity, equality, hierarchy, of course, the whole notion of types, the whole apparatus of these tropes, which can be deployed. It's like an arsenal, you can pick from that arsenal if you want to. And though Risley may well say that, well, I was a very skillful empirical student of Indian society, and this is what I observed. Remember that those first couple of pages, he says, it's observation, my observation. I'm suggesting that this observation is not in a vacuum. There is already the process of objectification which has long been at work, and he will in fact avail himself of that whole sociology of knowledge which emerges from that body of objectification, which will then help give rise to a kind of work of this kind. And this work exemplifies a whole strand of work. These were works that were encyclopedic in scope, that deployed various tools, as I pointed out, from cartography, statistics, photography, massive number of works. That slides with which I began this course, that was only a small representative sample from 1775 to 1840. And now for this period, every year there are going to be 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 works, right? So I think that that's what I have to say about this particular project. Anybody have any thoughts? Any questions? Any comments?
Just a small Please go ahead.
You go ahead.
It's not related to whatever has been talked, but it is more to the census thing.
Yes.
There is this interesting essay by Burlings called "Where did the question come from?" Right.
Question. Essay by who?
I think it was by Robert Burlings, right? And he particularly in that essay he asserts that the whole myth of origin,
Yes.
particularly, is a very colonial import, and he
Yeah.
gives us examples and evidences
Yeah.
from colonial books on the Garo tribes of
Uh-huh.
Meghalaya.
Okay.
So I would like your comments on that. Is it too far-fetched in saying that supposedly it's being a colonial import, or would it be a more general statement?
What would be a colonial import?
The whole
Question of origins.
origins.
That this is a particularly colonial way of thinking.
Yeah. And
Okay.
particularly because the tribes in many parts of Northeast,
Yeah.
particularly,
Yeah.
they have the certain myths of origins.
Yes.
And particularly that supposedly that this tribe has come in from there, it has traveled
That's right.
this and this.
That's right.
So he's arguing
Yeah.
that particularly this trend
Yeah.
is particularly due to certain colonial kind of.
I see. I see what you mean. If I understand you correctly, first let me make sure I understand correctly what you're saying. If I understand you correctly, then I'll attempt to answer the question. You're saying that according to this author, this particular tribe, the Garo, okay, but this would be true of other tribes as well. This interest they have in their own origins is in fact a colonial kind of self-understanding. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. That is very difficult to say. It's a possibility. It's very much a possibility. Although the first thing that needs to be said is that tribal India was in many ways, I'm using tribal India broadly, okay? Without distinction from one tribe to another. Because the colonial interaction with tribal India varied considerably from place to place. So for example, the colonial literature on the Santals is much richer than it is on many other tribes. All right? So that's why I'm adding all these caveats. I'm adding these caveats for that reason. It is very difficult to say what the degree of colonial penetration of the tribal worldview was. It varied considerably. They were able to escape in some ways the bulk of colonization precisely because in some ways, I'm putting it for the sake of convenience, we can refine these points because in some ways they constituted these non-state spaces. Okay, right? You see the point I'm trying to make. Okay, that's number one. Number two, it is very much possible what you're saying, but again, I'm a little bit reluctant to wholly accept the thesis without seeing exactly what he's suggesting because the question of origins is important in oral literature of most tribes. It is, and I can tell you that with quite a bit of certainty, looking not just at India, but looking, let's say, at American Indian groups. Each of them has a fairly rich literature on their origins. Their creation myths, they're called.
Originary myths of creation.
Yeah, creation myths. Most tribal groups have creation myths. So if the argument was that this quest for creation myths is actually a colonial form of self-understanding, I am not sure I would actually agree with that. The question is, did these creation myths change with the coming of writing, for example? Because many of the tribal groups, the literature was all in the oral tradition. All right. So we'd have to refine that point in a number of ways before I could say whether I agree with it or not. Okay? Yeah. Dipankar.
Yes, this is about Risley's book.
It's about what, sorry?
Risley's book.
Oh, the Risley book, yeah.
So I was just wondering whether he was working with very strict kind of binaries here. Self and other,
Yes.
things that take place in India almost never take place in England, back in England.
Yes.
Especially in the marriage issue.
Yeah.
But how far is it? I mean, how far is it really valid?
Yeah.
As far as the situation in England is concerned. I mean, when he says that in England a person has almost infinite number of choices.
Yes.
To make in terms
Yeah.
of choosing the partner
Yeah.
of life. Weren't there other categories in operation in England as well in order to highlight the quote-unquote exotic nature of Indian
Yes.
culture?
Yeah.
He is trying to simplify or suppress certain features of Western society
Yes.
in his book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aren't we?
Okay.
What is your take?
Oh, well, I have a lot to say about that. I'll try to keep myself brief. I mean, number one, England is a society that's highly stratified by class and has been for a very long period of time. English working class culture, for example, has been distinct for a very long period of time. I'm just, for the moment, we're just going to assume there is a working class culture. There are working class cultures, all right? If you track the history of English football clubs, I've read quite a bit of that. There's something common in those working class cultures. They're mainly working class cultures. And they're they use the word fanatics very easily when they're referring to Muslims or Hindus. These guys are fanatics. These English football, the followers of English football. They travel with the team, they follow the team everywhere, they give up their work. You read Bill Buford's book on thugs. That's what they do. They terrorize others. Okay, so they're not all the same. These are English working class cultures. There's very little in common here with the aristocratic set in England. In England, actually, I would say there's been relatively little intermarriage among different classes. Much of English literature is also about how you are stuck in the social circles in which you grow up. All right? So, in fact, what he's saying is that in principle, if you have to be charitable to Risley, you say in principle, he's saying that there's nothing that prevents a man and a woman from very different social backgrounds from marrying each other. Okay? But of course, there are enormous constraints which make that very difficult, those forms of intermarriage. Much of English literature, as I've said, is about either working class culture or it's about the aristocratic set. Oxbridge people very often just marry other Oxbridge people, for example. No British Prime Minister has not been a graduate of either Oxford or Cambridge. You could go on with data of this kind easily. So I'm not at all persuaded by Risley's. There's a definite element of exaggeration which was required by the argument, because the way in which you posit a sharp difference is you have to exaggerate at both ends, which he unquestionably is doing. All right, so that's one way in which one would really look at this particular question. I know you use the word binary. You probably have noticed that I've never used the word once in the last 5 days. I myself have found that this question of binaries is not being particularly, we all use it all the time and we use it for the sake of convenience. Is this really a book about the self and the other? Is this a book, let's phrase it this way, is this a book that, again, like many of the works, tells us more about the cultural milieu, the intellectual milieu from which Risley himself came out, right? To some degree, but I think when you're moving into the late 19th century, the nature of what you call Orientalism is not quite the same. Okay, that is that in the case of Tao, and many others, and Orm, I think the work is substantially about, to the extent that it's about anything, it's substantially about their intellectual milieu. When you're looking at something like Risley in the late 19th century, very early part of the 20th century, there is a kind of data which to some extent obviously reflects that reality that he's talking about. It may be, there may be, of course, as we have already argued, a process of objectification. But look at it this way. Don't forget for a moment that Orm and Dow are not anthropologists. He is an anthropologist. Now, this creates certain kinds of complications to which we have to be sensitive. Because anthropology, on the one hand, was predicated on the notion that there is a universal history of humankind. Even though anthropology is specifically a colonial discipline and is predicated on the study of the other, and it creates its own hierarchies, the anthropologist was in some ways always caught in a bind. That bind had to do with the fact that at some level the anthropologist is committed to the notion that humans are everywhere fundamentally the same. They're fundamentally the same, but the structures, if you have to use a Marxian language for a moment, remember the distinction between base and superstructure. The base is represented by the economic productions, the relations of production. The superstructure is aesthetics, poetry, law, all of that. Now, the anthropologist is fundamentally in some ways committed to the proposition that the base is the same. Whether you're English or Indian or Scot or Irish, you see? But that the superstructure is fundamentally different in some respects. And for an anthropologist like Risley, there is something of that. So you see that there are constant moments of betrayal where even though he's sharpening the difference, there are other places where he may be diminishing the difference. He may be diminishing it. We'll have to see. Unfortunately, we can't do that right now because I have to really spend quite some time. We'd have to see how that process is at work. So this, I'm suggesting, is what makes this particular project also different. That the tenor of Orientalism is not that this is any less Orientalist. The same tropes are there, unchanging India, that you saw in Orm or Dow. They're there here. But in some respects, late 19th century Orientalism also has its specific characteristics. That is the kind of thing that, in my view, Edward Said did not make clear at all, because I think it was a kind of a seamless narrative, in a way, in Orientalism. That it wasn't really clear how the tenor of Orientalism may have actually changed.
I was trying to hint at the diachronicity of Oriental discourse.
Yeah.
You know, pre-1857 and post-1857. So after Finland took over the control of India in an official manner, did the Orientalist discursive framework undergo any
Yes.
Change in any observable changes?
Yeah.
Also, one has to take into account the diachronicity of the colonial discursive field as it were. So, what was discursive field in the beginning of the 19th century was not similar to the discursive field in the beginning of the 20th century. So changes were also occurring like any other field.
Yes. Yes.
So, from that angle, I was wondering whether the gentleman Risley was also taking into account the fact that India was a changing subject to look at.
Yes. Yeah, that I don't know, because this is, you see that, you remember those paragraphs I read right at the beginning? That's
Changelessness as opposed to changes.
Yeah, no, look, at one level, yes, of course, there is actually admission of the fact that the that India today represents a set of questions, poses a set of questions that it didn't pose before. Last chapter is called caste and nationality, because nationality and nationalism, of course, are not the same. We know that, but what he's going to do in that chapter is he's actually going to point to the fact that questions of nationality will increasingly be posed, and caste will become important in how these questions are posed. Now, that seems to reflect an awareness of the fact that things have changed on the ground, correct? Right? But on the other hand, he is seriously committed to the idea that some aspect which is fundamental to the characterization of India for us, that will never change. Yeah.
So, regarding Kuhn's essay, he talks about certain rumors.
Certain rumors.
Rumors.
Yes.
About the first census
Yeah.
that happened. So,
Yeah.
what does he implicate on the census itself? What implications it had on the census?
What he is trying to suggest is that these rumors were very important in mobilizing people to identify themselves in certain ways. Those forms of identification will then become important as a caste category. There are two separate questions here, actually. If you have to analytically separate them out, one has to do with rumors. What are rumors? What is the place of rumors? There is a very rich body of literature on rumors, because rumors were at one point things that you didn't study. I mean, if you were to translate rumor, kahani hai, rumor is something that has no basis in fact, right? But to suppose that because it has no basis in fact, therefore it doesn't play an operative role would be quite naive, right? I mean, look at the whole election of Donald Jackass Trump, right? I mean, what is that about? Fake news. That's what it's about. Rumors. How this fake news was used. So you see, that's an analytical you have to analytically segment that out. There's a question about rumors, because in order to pose that question, first we would have to understand what are rumors, how do they work, what is their place in history, what place did they play in the French Revolution, for example. That was where the first scholarly work was done on rumors, is the role they played in the French Revolution. Okay? Then the specific question can be answered. That specific question, as I've said to you, is he's trying to say that these rumors become the grounds on which people get politically animated. When they become politically animated, they become political subjects. When they become political subjects, they then decide that they need some form of mobilization. Why do they need mobilization? Because mobilization gives you strength. And once you have that, that in turn becomes the place for the codification of a certain kind of identity. Okay? That's the nature of the argument. Any further thoughts? All right, I think we can call it a day.